The air trembled. 30 meters separated two armies. On one side, a living wall of Gallic shields, tall, painted, pressed shoulder to shoulder like a barrier of wood and flesh. Tens of thousands of warriors with faces painted in lime, hair stiffened with grease, eyes locked on the enemy line. On the other side, silence. Rows of Roman legionaries standing motionless beneath the son of Gaul. Each one held in his right hand a long, slender shaft, tipped with an iron point that barely glinted in the light. It did not look like much, it was not imposing, it did not inspire fear at first glance. Then a centurion raised his arm. He held it for an instant and let it fall. What followed was not a war cry. It was a sound, a deep, dense whistle, like the hum of 1,000 wasps crossing the sky at once. Hundreds of those shafts rose together, tracing a dark arc against the clouds, and fell upon the Gallic line like a rain of black iron. Shields cracked, wood splintered. Pyramidal tips punched through the boards like knives sinking into wet clay, but the worst part was not the impact. The worst came after. When the Gallic warriors tried to tear those javelins from their shields, the iron had bent. It would not come out, it would not break, it would not cut. It only weighed, dragged, and crippled. One after another, the Gauls dropped their defenses and stood naked before the charge that was already coming. The legionaries drew their short swords, pressed their shields against their chests, and advanced upon men who had nothing left to protect themselves with. The battle was over before it began, and the weapon that made it possible was not the sword, nor the shield, nor even discipline. It was that slender shaft of soft iron that destroyed itself upon impact, a weapon designed not to kill, but to disarm, not to last, but to die at the exact moment it fulfilled its purpose. Its name was Pilum, and with it, Rome conquered the world. To understand why the Pilum was the most ingenious weapon of antiquity, one must first understand the world in which it was born. For centuries, the armies of the Mediterranean fought in a nearly universal manner. Heavy infantry armed with a shield in one hand and a long spear in the other. The spear was the primary weapon. The sword, a secondary tool, used only when the spear broke or the fighting became too close. Greeks, Persians, Carthaginians, Macedonians all followed this logic. It was the fundamental principle of ancient warfare. The Macedonian phalanx, heir to Philip II and perfected by Alexander the Great, carried this idea to its ultimate expression. Rows of soldiers bearing sarissas over 5 meters long, forming an impenetrable forest of iron points that advanced like a living wall. From the fields of Cheronea to the sands of Gaugamela, that formation had crushed every army that dared to face it. For nearly 200 years, the phalanx reigned over the battlefields of the known world. No one found a way to stop it head-on. No one defeated it using its own logic. But the Romans did not try to copy that model. They did not seek to build a better phalanx. They did something radically different, something that at the time must have seemed like madness. They replaced the long spear with 2 heavy javelins and turned the short sword into their primary contact weapon. That heavy javelin was the pilum, and that decision, seemingly contrary to every established principle of military logic, would transform warfare forever. The pilum was not an ordinary spear. It was an instrument of military engineering as refined as it was brutal, as calculated as a Roman bridge, as precise as an aqueduct. It measured approximately 2 meters in length. Its lower half was a shaft of ashwood, solid, balanced, fitted with a leather or felt grip so the hand would not slip at the moment of release. That wooden half provided the weight and inertia needed for the weapon to fly with force and stability. But its upper half was what made it something no other civilization had ever conceived. A slender iron shank, roughly 60 centimeters long and barely 7 millimeters in diameter, ending in a small, extremely sharp pyramidal tip. That tip was capable of piercing up to 3 centimeters of solid wood. Modern experimental archaeology has confirmed this again and again. It did not strike the enemy shield, it punched through it, and here lay the genius of the design. The tip was hardened, but the iron shank that supported it was made of mild steel, uncarbonized, deliberately soft. This meant that upon impacting a shield, the tip penetrated cleanly through the wood, but the rest of the shank, bearing the force of the collision and the weight of the wooden shaft dragging behind it, bent. It curved, it twisted, and the pyramidal head, wider than the shank, became trapped inside the wood, like a hook inside a fish. Impossible to extract in the heat of battle, impossible to cut because the iron shank resisted the edge of any sword, and with the shank twisted, the entire weapon hung from the shield like a dead weight of more than 2 kilograms, dragging it toward the ground, making every movement clumsy, every block too slow, every defense impossible. The warrior who received a Pilum in his shield had 2 options, both terrible. The first was to try to pull it out, but the pyramidal head caught in the wood like a thorn, and the more he pulled, the more the hole expanded without the point coming free. Every second lost in that struggle was a second the legionaries used to close the distance. The second option was to drop the shield and face the Romans with no protection at all, chest bare, with only a sword and his own flesh between him and death. Either option favored Rome. It was not a design accident, it was not a fortunate side effect. It was pure intention, pure engineering applied to destruction. The Pilum existed for a single moment, and in that moment, it changed everything. The origins of the Pilum are lost in the mists of archaic Italy. The oldest archaeological finds come from Etruscan settlements at Volsi and Talamone, dated between the 8th and 5th centuries before Christ. Some historians believe the Romans adopted the weapon from the Samnites, a warlike mountain people of central Italy against whom they fought decades of fierce wars between the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ. The Samnite Wars were a crucible where Rome forged not only its character, but its way of fighting. The Samnites fought in loose order, hurling heavy javelins from the hills, avoiding the frontal clash that the Romans, still using Greek phalanx tactics, sought. Those humiliating defeats forced Rome to rethink its entire military system. Other scholars point to the influence of Iberian weapons, such as the Phalarica and the Soliferium, heavy, solid iron javelins that the peoples of Hispania wielded with devastating effect. What is certain is that, whatever its exact origin, the Romans perfected the concept into something no one else could replicate with the same effectiveness. From at least the 3rd century before Christ, after the reorganization into the manipular army, the Pilum became a fundamental part of the legionaries' equipment, alongside the gladius, the short sword of Hispanic origin, and the scutum, the great rectangular shield that covered a soldier from chin to knees. Each legionary carried 2 pila, one heavy and one lighter. The lighter one had a longer and thinner shank, designed to cover greater distance, capable of reaching targets at 30 or even 40 meters. Its function was the first wave, the opening blow that slowed the enemy advance and sowed the first casualties. The heavy one was shorter, sturdier, with greater penetrating power. It was thrown from closer range at 15 to 20 meters when the clash was imminent. Its function was the decisive one, to shatter shields, to cripple defenses, to open the road for the gladius. The tactic was as simple as it was lethal. The legionaries advanced in formation until they reached throwing distance. Then, at the centurion's signal, the first volley soared through the air. Hundreds of pila traced a somber arc against the sky, a dark cloud that for an instant blotted out the sunlight. The enemy raised their shields, but the pyramidal tips pierced through them with the same ease that a needle pierces cloth. Seconds later, the second volley, heavier, closer, more devastating. The enemy's shields were now death traps. Those that had not been perforated were pinned with iron shanks that weighed like anchors. The opposing formation disintegrated into a chaos of men, trying to rid themselves of useless shields, stumbling over the bodies of the fallen, desperately searching for a defense that no longer existed. And at that precise instant, the legionaries drew their gladius, closed ranks, pressed their scutum tight, and charged, not like a horde, like a machine fueled by discipline and designed to exploit exactly the chaos the Pilum had created. Julius Caesar left one of the most vivid accounts of the Pilum's effect in combat. In his commentaries on the Gallic War, he describes the battle against the Helvetii in the year 58 before Christ. His legions held a hill when the immense mass of Helvetian warriors advanced from below. Caesar ordered the volley. The legionaries, hurling their pila from an elevated position, punched through the enemy formation with ease. Gravity added its force to the strength of the arm. The javelins fell like meteors. Caesar wrote that sometimes a single pilum pierced several shields at once, pinning them together, chaining one warrior to the man beside him. The Gauls were literally bound to each other by an iron shaft that had punched through their defenses. And when the tip bent, it was impossible to extract. The Helvetii, their left hand trapped beneath the weight of the crippled shield, shook their arms trying to free themselves. Many, after struggling uselessly against that iron trap for seconds that must have felt like eternities, ended up hurling their shields to the ground and facing the Romans with their bodies exposed. Caesar did not describe this with wonder. He described it as routine. For a Roman army of the 1st century before Christ, this was simply what the Pilum did. Every time, in every battle, with the same mechanical precision, but even a brilliant weapon can be improved. And that improvement came from the hand of one of the most transformative generals in military history. Gaius Marius, the man who reformed the Roman legions from the ground up, turning an army of land-owning citizens into a permanent professional force, is frequently credited with a crucial modification to the Pilum. Around the year 101 before Christ, before the Battle of Vercellae against the Cimbri, a Germanic horde that had terrorized Rome for a decade, Marius discovered a troubling problem. In some battles, the iron shank of the pilum did not bend sufficiently upon impact. The weapon remained intact after the strike, and the enemy picked it up from the ground and hurled it back. Against the Romans themselves, the weapon designed to disarm the enemy was becoming its own threat. Marius's solution was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its effectiveness. He ordered that one of the two iron rivets joining the metal shank to the wooden shaft be replaced with a wooden pin, a simple piece of wood that performed its function of holding the weapon together during transport, the march, and the throw, but that snapped at the instant of impact. When the pin broke, the wooden shaft hung limply from the single remaining rivet, and the entire weapon collapsed. Twisted, useless, impossible to reuse. It could not be thrown, it could not be wielded as a spear, it could not be recycled by the enemy. It only served for what it had already done, destroying the shield it had pierced. And after the battle, Roman armorers simply replaced the broken wooden pin with a new one in a matter of minutes. The most sophisticated weapon in the army was repaired with a scrap of wood that any carpenter could fashion while eating his lunch. It was in the great battles against the Macedonian phalanxes that the pilum proved its true strategic superiority in a way that changed the history of the world. At Cynocephalae, in the year 197 before Christ, the Roman legions of Titus Quinctius Flamininus faced the phalanxes of Philip V of Macedon in the hills of Thessaly. The Macedonian phalanx was a fearsome formation, perhaps the most feared in the ancient world. Soldiers armed with sarissas over 5 meters long, packed shoulder to shoulder, creating an impenetrable forest of iron points that advanced like an unstoppable wave. Since the days of Alexander, That formation had crushed Persians, Indians, Egyptians, and Greeks alike. But the phalanx had a weakness that its commanders knew but could not eliminate. It could only attack in one direction. It only functioned on flat, even ground. And when its cohesion broke, the soldiers within it, both hands occupied holding those enormous pikes, were left completely defenseless in close combat. They had no free shield. They had no sword at the ready. They were giants with their arms tied. The Romans did not try to overpower the phalanx with brute force. They used the Pilum to fragment it. When the uneven terrain of the Cynocephalae hills forced the Macedonian formation to stretch and lose its perfect cohesion, the legionaries exploited every gap, every crack in that wall of pikes. Pila fell upon the exposed flanks in coordinated volleys. The Macedonian soldiers, unable to raise shields while gripping their sarissas with both hands, received the javelins as one receives rain, helpless to do anything but fall. The pyramidal tips penetrated between the ranks like water seeping through cracks in a wall, and when the formation disintegrated, the legionaries entered the empty spaces with their gladius, cutting and stabbing men who had nothing to defend themselves with at close range. Philip lost more than 13,000 men that day. The phalanx, undefeated for generations, had found its executioner. 30 years later, at Pydna, in the year 168 before Christ, the story repeated itself with even more devastating clarity. The legions of Lucius Aemilius Paulus faced the phalanx of Perseus, the last king of Macedon. At first, the phalanx advanced with such overwhelming force that the Romans themselves retreated, genuinely terrified before that forest of pikes moving like a living organism, a monster of bronze and iron devouring the ground. The sarissas descended in uniform waves, and everything they touched perished. But the terrain was uneven. Hills rose and fell, streams crossed the field. As the phalanx pursued the retreating Romans, the ranks opened. Gaps appeared between the soldiers, and into those gaps the legionaries infiltrated like wolves entering a flock. Pila flew at distances so close it was impossible to miss. Every javelin found flesh or wood. The phalangites, trapped in their own formation, could not turn, could not retreat, could not drop their enormous pikes in the cramped space that surrounded them. They fell where they stood, pierced by Roman iron, drowned in their own tactical perfection. The Battle of Pydna did not merely end the kingdom of Macedon forever. It ended the era of the phalanx as the dominant formation in the Mediterranean, and the Pilum was the tool that made that historic transition possible. But the Pilum did not only serve as a javelin. Its versatility was yet another testament to Roman pragmatism taken to its ultimate consequences. At the siege of Alesia in the year 52 before Christ, when Caesar's legions found themselves trapped between the Gallic army of Vercingetorix inside the fortress and a massive relief army attacking from outside, the legionaries used their pila as handheld thrusting spears in close-quarters combat, stabbing over the palisades at Gauls who scrambled to climb. At the Battle of Pharsalus, in the year 48 before Christ, during the civil war that split the Republic in two, Caesar ordered a special cohort to use their pila not as projectiles, but as stabbing weapons, aiming directly at the faces of Pompey's cavalry. The horsemen, young Roman aristocrats who feared scars more than death, scattered before that brutal and unexpected tactic. And when a barrier was needed against cavalry charges, the legionaries drove their pila into the ground at an angle, tips pointing toward the enemy, creating an improvised palisade of iron that no horse dared cross. One weapon, multiple functions, all lethal. The evolution of the Pilum continued across the centuries, reflecting Rome's capacity for constant adaptation. During the High Empire, a metal sphere was added at the junction between the iron shank and the wooden shaft. This ball, generally of lead or bronze, served as a counterweight, concentrating more mass at the point of impact and increasing the weapon's penetrating power without needing to increase its total weight. The Pilum of the imperial period were lighter than their Republican ancestors, weighing around 2 kilograms, but they compensated for that reduction with a more aerodynamic design, a more refined tip, and that sphere that directed all the energy of impact toward the target. Modern experimental archaeology, using exact replicas constructed according to the specifications of archaeological finds, has demonstrated that a pilum thrown from 10 meters could pierce a pine board 3 centimeters thick and protrude dozens of centimeters out the other side. In one test, a pilum punched through a car door. At 15 meters, it still penetrated light armor of leather and mail. At 30 meters, its maximum effective range, it was still capable of embedding itself in a shield with enough force to render it completely useless. These are not the speculations of historians. They are data confirmed by replicas thrown under controlled conditions. The pilum worked exactly as the Romans said it worked. Caesar did not exaggerate. Polybius did not lie. Vegetius did not fantasize. But like any weapon tied to a specific era, the pilum had its limits, and those limits became evident as the empire expanded into territories where the rules of war were different. On the eastern frontiers, the Romans encountered armored Persian and Parthian horsemen, the fearsome cataphracts, against whom the pilum proved less effective. These mounted warriors, covered from head to toe in scale armor of interlocking metal plates, charged at speeds that drastically reduced the time available to throw. And unlike Gallic or Germanic foot soldiers, they did not depend on wooden shields that the pilum could penetrate and cripple. Their protection was the metal itself that encased them. Moreover, the dreaded Parthian horse archers, who fired while galloping in retreat in what became known as the Parthian shot, maintained distances that far exceeded the pilum's range. The Romans needed something with greater reach, something that could be projected farther, faster, against enemies who refused to stand still and wait for the volley. And so began the slow decline of the weapon that had defined the legions. From the 3rd century after Christ onward, the lancea, a lighter, more versatile spear with greater range, began replacing the pilum in many units. Later came the plumbata, a small dart with a lead counterweight that doubled the range of the old pilum and could be carried in far greater quantities. Each soldier carried 5 plumbati fastened to the inside of his shield, ready to be hurled in rapid succession. The Roman equipment was changing, as it had changed so many times before, adapting to new enemies, new terrains, new strategic realities. And as the late Roman army transformed, incorporating ever greater numbers of warriors of Germanic, Gothic, and Sarmatian origin, the weapons and tactics of those peoples gradually displaced the ancient legionary traditions. By the 4th century, the pilum had virtually disappeared from the battlefield, not because it had failed, but because the world for which it was created, the world of manipular legions, of Macedonian phalanxes, of wooden shields, and warriors who fought on foot in close formation, had ceased to exist. And yet its legacy endured far beyond its last volley. The pilum was not merely a weapon, it was a philosophy condensed in iron and wood. The revolutionary idea that an instrument of war could be designed not to survive combat, but to transform it at the instant of its own destruction. A weapon that sacrificed itself to grant advantage, that died so its bearer might live, that bent, broke, and became useless, and precisely because of that, exactly because of that, fulfilled its purpose. No other civilization of antiquity thought this way. The Gauls forged swords meant to last entire generations. The Greeks polished spears that passed from fathers to sons as sacred heirlooms. The Persians adorned their weapons with gold because they considered them extensions of personal honor. But the Romans created a disposable weapon, an industrial instrument, a piece of military engineering that existed for a single moment, for a single flight of 30 meters, for a single impact lasting less than a second. And in that second, it changed everything. That mentality of thinking in systems rather than isolated objects, in collective results rather than individual feats, in mechanical efficiency rather than artisanal beauty, was what made Rome fundamentally different from every empire that preceded it. The Pilum did not win battles on its own. It won because it was part of a larger system, more complex, more coordinated than anything the ancient world had ever seen. A system where every element, the shield that protected, the sword that cut, the formation that held, the discipline that executed, the training that automated, fit with the others like gears in a mechanism. The Pilum created chaos, the gladius exploited it, the scutum protected the man, who wielded both, and discipline ensured that everything happened in the right order, at the right moment, with the right precision, every time, without exception. Without improvisation, without individual glory, only the system, only the result. Today, the fields where the Pilum fell like black rain are covered in grass and silence. At Cynocephalae, Greek shepherds walk over the ground where the Macedonian phalanxes disintegrated forever. At Pydna, tourists photograph broken columns without knowing that an entire military era died there. On the plains of Gaul, French farmers plough the same earth where Caesar watched the Helvetii drop their shields and fall. But beneath that earth, buried by centuries of rain and oblivion, fragments of twisted iron still rest. Pyramidal tips rusted beyond recognition. Shanks bent at angles that only impact could have created. Silent remains of a weapon that did exactly what it was designed to do. It struck, it bent, it broke, and with that silent destruction, it built the most powerful empire the ancient world ever knew, because that is the eternal paradox of the Pilum. The most powerful weapon in Rome was the one that did not survive its own success. It did not gleam after victory. It was not displayed as a trophy in the temples. It did not hang on the wall of any triumphant general. It was gathered from the mud after the battle, straightened if possible, fitted with a fresh wooden pin, and prepared to die again in the next confrontation. Without glory, without a name, without memory, only function, only purpose, only result. And in that mechanical humility, in that absolute willingness to be destroyed for the sake of something greater than itself, lay perhaps the most profound lesson Rome left the world, that true strength does not reside in what endures, but in what is given at the decisive moment, that victory does not belong to the weapon that survives intact, but to the one that fulfills its mission, even if it means ceasing to exist, and that sometimes the most powerful thing an instrument of war can do is destroy itself at the exact instant it changes the course of history. The centuries passed, empires fell, the legions marched for the last time and vanished into the dust of the roads. But every time an engineer designs something to fulfill a single, perfect function, every time a strategist thinks in systems rather than isolated pieces, every time someone understands that the value of an instrument lies not in its permanence, but in the magnitude of its impact, the echo of the Pilum still resonates, silent, invisible, bent by the weight of its own sacrifice, but eternal in what it left behind, a world transformed by an iron shaft that chose to break,